Hi everyone, it's Lauren, and today I'm going to be talking you through and reviewing all of the books that I read in the month of October. As always, there's going to be a list and links to each of the books in the description box below if you're particularly interested in any of them and want to look into them a little bit more for yourself. I've read some pretty good books this month, but there's one that really stands out for me, and I need to be quite careful that I don't just turn this whole video into an appreciation of this one singular book. But I think it's my favourite book that I've read so far this year, and that's Delusions of Gender by Cordelia Fine. Now, I did think I was going to like this book before I read it, to be fair, because it's all about picking apart our preconceptions about gender, and it's looking into, really, is gender something from society that we're socialised into, or is it about differences in a male and female brain? What she's doing in this book is really examining this hypothesis that men and women are different because their brains are different, or because their minds are different and they work in a different way. So she looks socially at this idea that women are more empathetic and better at multitasking, and men are better at honing in on a specific task and becoming experts in certain things like science. And she kind of comes at it from all angles. She looks at lots of different studies that have looked at infants and kind of the kind of toys that children are interested in, and kind of anecdotal studies about men and women and how they behave. And she also looks at studies that have focused in specifically on the brain itself, how different brains are structured, how they operate, and it's just fascinating because there are so many different studies. This is so well researched, and as she goes through them, she sees that all these studies, the scientists themselves are coming at it with a preconception as to how men and women behave. So, for example, one study might show that women use both half of their brains to do a certain task or to think a certain thing, and whereas men are more likely to use one side of their brains. And the scientists will immediately snap to, oh, this is why women are better at empathising or multitasking, because they're using both halves of their brain, and the man is better at just using one part of his brain. And yet another study will show like completely the opposite thing and say, well, this is why men are better at being professionals and being experts in things, because they use more parts of their brain. And it's just, these things don't add up, and people are just jumping to conclusions which they've been socialised to believe, and they're not looking at the actual scientific facts. And it's just amazing how systematically she goes through all of these different studies. I mean, I can't even give you examples as to all the things that she goes through, because I will just be reading the book back to you. But she goes through so many different studies, and she comes at it from all these different angles, and almost every time she looks at the result of these studies and says, well, how does this show that at birth a male mind and a female mind are different? Like, how does this show that women are better suited to household labour and men are better suited to being president and prime minister, like, from birth? Like, how does any of this show that, other than when babies are born, they are then socialised to behave a certain way? Like, she's trying to unpick this idea that gender is innate. For example, she looks at studies that have been done of groups of monkeys where the females in these groups are more likely to do the nurturing of the infants. And then she says, okay, that's great, but this exact same group of monkeys in a different part of the world, exactly the same species, the same relation to us, in that society of monkeys, the males are more likely to do the nurturing. So she's saying even within animal societies, it's more about what's learned, that it is an innate thing, that women are more programmed to nurture. It's like she's trying to argue that men are equally programmed to nurture as a baby. It's just the way that we grow up and the way we're socialised. Oh, I don't know if I'm even explaining this properly, but it's just absolutely fascinating. And she just has so much evidence, like overwhelming amount of evidence, which shows that children are just very keen to socialise themselves. They're categorised from such a young age as being a boy or a girl, so when they see other boys or other girls doing certain things and men and women doing certain things, they want to align themselves to that. I said this whole video wasn't going to be about this book, I'm so sorry, but the other thing that I really loved about it was her tone and her voice. It was very much like being in a lecture, I felt, and she was very kind of calm and systematic and just going through the data, but it did have elements of her own personality in there. She didn't talk about herself and her own experiences that much, just when it was relevant, and considering this is a very complex thing, she's really looking at the science of the brain, like neuroscience, things that I have no idea about. I felt like it was really easy to understand. And in fact, I mean, if you are into reading kind of feminist, gender studies, equality-based literature, I actually felt like this was easier to understand than a lot of other books, such as We Should All Be Feminists by Bell Hooks, because those books rely on definitions of societal structures, such as the patriarchy and oppression and things like that, which if you don't really know what that means, it can be quite difficult to access. And she's not really looking at society here. She's just looking at the science of gender, like the pure science of it. She's not talking about oppression and patriarchy and intersectionality and how people experience sexism and gender difference. She's looking at, but is gender actually a thing? Does gender difference actually exist on a scientific, biological form? Or is it that as we grow up into adults, we are socialised in a certain way, and therefore, because brains are so plastic, they do change over time? I just love it. I probably should do a whole video on this, which is less rambly and more to the point, where I talk about everything I love about it. Or you could all just read it yourselves, which is actually what you should do. Next, I read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, and yeah, this was okay. I quite enjoyed the reading experience because I quite like her writing. As a plot, as a book to read, I didn't enjoy it as much as I have some of her other work. This is about a family, the Ramsey family, who have 8 children, and the first part of the book takes place when they're all at their summer house with some friends as well, and most of this section of the book is taking place over one day and mostly one dinner. The second part of the book then shows the passage of time and how the house changes, and the third section we have the family returning as adults and making a trip to the lighthouse, which they didn't get to do all those years before. So it's really about time and life and death. We spend time in each of the characters' minds and we really see how they feel about themselves and how they interpret other people, and it's quite interesting to see how that's then interpreted by other characters, and it's kind of about moments in life and whether they're important and kind of how moments are so fleeting. It's about memory and kind of what our lives mean further down the road, like after we've died. That's what I've taken from it. And I did really enjoy certain passages where she was inside the mind of Mrs. Ramsey. The women, maybe it's just me, but the women I found kind of easier to tell apart and understand what was going on. There were quite a few male characters in this book who I couldn't really quite work out who they were, and I couldn't work out the difference between them because she's jumping between characters so much, and it's not a typical traditional narrative where she's like, and then Mr. Smith walked in. It's just, you're sort of jumping around trying to piece it all together in typical Woolf fashion. It's one of those books where, it's quite short and technically there's not a great deal of plot, but the prose does take quite a long time to read, so it is quite slow, and by the end of it I was kind of like, okay, I'm done now. Like the third section of the book I was a bit bored. And finally, a brand new novel that I picked up, which was Moth by Sarah Perry. Sarah Perry wrote The Essex Serpent, which was one of my favourite books a couple of years ago, so I was really excited to pick up her new one. This is very different, and I'm going to try and consciously not compare this to The Essex Serpent during this review, because they are just very different books. On balance, I think I preferred The Essex Serpent, but there's elements in this which I absolutely loved as well. So in this book, we follow this woman, Helen Franklin, who is living in Prague. One of her friends comes up to her, very distressed, saying he's heard about this woman, Moth, who is this kind of biblical / mythological figure. He's been reading lots of different accounts about her, and what she is this woman who witnesses what people do. So it's got some elements of the supernatural in there. He's worried that Moth has been watching him, and he gives all of his files over to Helen. He's like, you need to read this, you need to understand. And she's the kind of character which watches people's sins. She's been wandering the earth for thousands of years. She's so lonely, and she finds people in their most loneliest and at their most desperate and asks them to come with her. So Helen's friend is very scared that she's going to ask him to come with her. And then we see Helen reading these journals, these different kind of source material, I suppose, different points in history where other people have claimed they've seen Moth. So you're reading all of these different accounts, and you're also following Helen on her journey and trying to work out why she's in Prague, because she has a history which she is feeling very guilty for, and something that she's keeping secret as well. So as a narrative, it's quite choppy and quite bitty, because we're spending time with Helen and we're also reading all of these different, I guess, source material. There's some diaries. They're mostly diaries, to be fair, and some letters, all from different parts of history. And to be honest, I actually really enjoyed the letters. There's a section set in Prague during the Second World War, which I really enjoyed. I found that very interesting, which is all about the kind of the native Germans who were living in Czechoslovakia at the time, and all the horrors that went on there. All of the different stories are really about how awful human beings can be to each other, and Mel Moth is there as the witness to us in our most disgusting and vile. I really liked those sections. I'm not sure I really was interested in Helen particularly as a character, or that interested in her story, but I really liked how it all kind of came together at the end. So it depends what you're interested in reading, I guess. I really liked the historical nature of this novel. I really liked the supernatural elements of it. I did think this is a really good time of year to read this book because it is quite spooky in places, and I actually think it would make a really good movie or perhaps a TV series. If it was adapted, I can really visualise it working well in that sense. But if you're someone who wants to stay with one character and just read a plot about them, then this won't be for you because there's lots of moving around. But if you like the idea of kind of getting lots of different characters' perspectives and reading about lots of different things, if you like short story collections, then this might be more for you. So only 3 this month, but I kind of like it when I have fewer books per video really, because it gives me more of a chance to really get into them and discuss them properly. I'd love to hear from you what you've been reading this month. I would love to hear from you if you've read any of these books before, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!